Thomas Blackwood sat at his kitchen table staring at the envelope that had arrived in the morning mail. The return address was unfamiliar, a P.O. box in a town he'd never heard of. His coffee had gone cold beside him, forgotten as soon as he'd opened the mysterious letter. Inside was a faded photograph and a handwritten note on yellowed paper. The photo showed his mother Eleanor as a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, standing beside a tall man with a serious expression. Their arms were linked, and his mother was smiling, a carefree smile he'd rarely seen in life. The note contained just 5 words. The truth lies with her. Thomas ran his thumb over the photograph, studying the stranger's face. Who was this man? And why had someone sent this to him now, 3 years after his mother's death? He picked up his phone and called his sister. Catherine? It's me. Something strange came in the mail today. If it's another one of those extended warranty offers, just throw it away, Catherine said, the sounds of her busy household evident in the background. No, it's about Mom. Someone sent me an old photograph of her with a man I don't recognize. The background noise on Catherine's end diminished as she presumably moved to a quieter room. What do you mean? Like an old boyfriend? I don't know. Could be. But there's a note too. It says the truth lies with her. With Mom? That doesn't make any sense. She's been gone for 3 years. Thomas pressed his fingers against his temple, feeling the beginning of a headache. I know. That's what's bothering me. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the photograph now placed on his nightstand. His mother had always been private about her past, deflecting questions with vague answers or changing the subject entirely. As a child, he'd never thought much of it, but now. The following morning, Thomas called in sick to the university where he taught history. Instead of lecturing on the American Civil War, he drove to his childhood home where his father still lived. The 2-story house needed painting, and the garden his mother had tended so lovingly was now overgrown. His father, Robert, answered the door in his bathrobe despite it being nearly noon. Tom? Weren't expecting you today. His father's voice was rough, permanently altered by decades of smoking before Eleanor had made him quit. Sorry to drop by unannounced, Dad. I wanted to ask you something. In the cluttered living room, Thomas showed his father the photograph. Robert squinted at it, then shook his head. Never seen him before. Where'd you get this? Thomas explained about the letter. Do you know what it might mean? Did Mom ever mention someone from her past? Robert handed the photo back, his weathered hand trembling slightly. Your mother didn't talk much about before we met. Said she had a rough childhood and preferred looking forward. He paused, eyes distant. There were times I'd wake up and find her sitting by the window in the middle of the night. When I'd ask what was wrong, she'd say she was just thinking. This was news to Thomas. You never told me that. Didn't seem important. Everyone's got their demons. Thomas left his father's house with more questions than answers. On impulse, he drove to the local library where they kept town records and old newspapers. He spent hours searching for anything about his mother, but found only the expected entries: her marriage announcement to his father, her work with the local garden club, and finally, her obituary. Eleanor Blackwood, beloved wife, mother, and community member. Nothing about her life before she'd arrived in town as a young woman of 25. Over the next few days, Thomas became increasingly obsessed with uncovering his mother's past. He neglected his work, spending every free moment digging through family albums and boxes of old documents stored in his attic. In one dusty container, he found his mother's birth certificate, but something seemed off about it. The paper looked newer than it should for someone born in the 1950s. He called the records office in the town where she claimed to have been born. After a lengthy conversation, the clerk informed him that they had no record of an Eleanor Mills, his mother's maiden name being born on that date. Could be a clerical error from back then, the clerk suggested. Records weren't kept as carefully. But Thomas wasn't convinced. Next, he found his parents' marriage certificate. The date matched what he'd always known, but he noticed his mother's Signature looked practiced, almost too perfect, as if she had carefully studied how to write Eleanor Mills. A week after receiving the photograph, Thomas visited his mother's older sister, Aunt Martha, who lived in a retirement community an hour away. Martha had always been close to Eleanor, and if anyone knew about his mother's past, it would be her. Martha welcomed him with a warm hug, her thin frame fragile in his arms. Her apartment smelled of cinnamon and old books. "What brings you all the way out here?" she asked as she poured tea into delicate cups. Thomas placed the photograph on her coffee table. "I'm hoping you can tell me who this man is with Mom." Martha's hand froze midair, teapot suspended. A drop of tea splashed onto the table. She carefully set the pot down and reached for her glasses, though Thomas suspected she could see the photo perfectly well. "Where did you get this?" Her voice had lost its warmth. "Someone sent it to me. Anonymous, with a note saying, 'The truth lies with her.'" Martha's lips pressed into a thin line. She stared at the photograph for a long time before speaking. "Your mother had a life before she met your father, a life she chose to leave behind." "What kind of life?" Martha looked up at him, her eyes suddenly looking every bit of her 87 years. "One that wasn't safe to talk about, even now." "Aunt Martha, Mom's been gone for 3 years. What danger could there possibly be? Some secrets don't die with the person who kept them." She pushed the photograph back toward him. "Let it go, Thomas. Your mother wanted it that way." But Thomas couldn't let it go. On his way home from Martha's, his car was followed by a black sedan that stayed 2 cars behind him the entire journey. When he stopped for gas, the sedan parked across the street, its windows tinted too dark to see the driver. That night, Thomas returned home to find his front door slightly ajar, though he was certain he'd locked it. Inside, nothing appeared to be missing, but his mother's old study, preserved exactly as she'd left it, had been ransacked. Books pulled from shelves, desk drawers emptied onto the floor. As he was cleaning up the mess, his phone rang with an unknown number. "Hello?" "Stop looking." The voice was disguised, low and gravelly. "Some graves should stay undisturbed." The line went dead. Thomas sat among the scattered papers of his mother's life, heart pounding. He should call the police, report the break-in and the threatening call. But something told him this went beyond ordinary crime. The next morning, he found a small key among his mother's things that had been overlooked by the intruder. It was old and brass, possibly for a safety deposit box. Thomas remembered his mother occasionally visiting the bank on her own, telling him and Catherine to wait in the car. The key and the photograph. The stranger's warning. His aunt's fear. The inconsistencies in his mother's documents. Thomas stared at the photograph again, at the face of the man standing beside his young mother. There was something in their posture, not romantic, but protective. Official, almost. A terrible thought began to form in Thomas's mind. What if the answers he sought weren't in old records or family stories? What if his mother had literally taken her secrets to the grave? That evening, as rain pattered against his windows, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He would petition the court for an exhumation order. His mother's coffin might contain more than just her remains. He would find the truth, no matter how deeply it had been buried. The university granted Thomas a leave of absence, though his department head wasn't happy about it. Family emergency, Thomas had explained vaguely, unable to articulate the growing obsession that consumed his thoughts. How could he explain that he needed to uncover secrets his mother had taken to her grave? Thomas converted his living room into an investigation center. Papers covered every surface, photocopies of documents, printouts of emails, notes scribbled on yellow legal pads. A large corkboard leaned against one wall, where he'd pinned the mysterious photograph and connected strings between bits of information like a detective in a crime movie. His sister Catherine stopped by unexpectedly one afternoon carrying a casserole dish. "Dad said you haven't been answering his calls," she said, taking in the chaotic room with wide eyes. "What on earth are you doing?" Thomas showed her his findings. The birth certificate with paper too new for its supposed age. The strange marriage. Certificate signature. The key he'd found. And the records showing his mother hadn't existed on paper before age 25. "You broke into Mom's safety deposit box?" Catherine asked, horrified when he mentioned his trip to the bank. "I didn't break in. I'm her son and an executor of her estate. The bank manager let me access it after I showed him the death certificate." Thomas ran a hand through his unwashed hair. "But that's just it, Kath. The box was empty. Completely empty, like someone had cleared it out." Catherine set down the casserole dish, untouched. "Tom, this isn't healthy. Mom died 3 years ago. Whatever secrets she had, maybe they should stay buried with her." "That's just it," Thomas said, voice rising with excitement. "I think that's literally where they are. Buried with her." His sister's face paled. "Please tell me you're not thinking what I think you're thinking." Thomas couldn't meet her eyes. "I've already contacted a lawyer about the process for exhumation." Catherine left his house in tears, the casserole forgotten on his cluttered coffee table. The next morning, Thomas drove to the small town where his mother had supposedly grown up. The place existed, but when he visited the local high school, they had no record of an Eleanor Mills attending in the years she should have been there. The public library's newspaper archives showed no mention of her in graduation announcements or community events. It was as if Eleanor Blackwood had simply materialized at age 25 when she met Thomas's father. On his way back home, Thomas noticed a black sedan similar to the one that had followed him before. He took several random turns and the car stayed with him. Pulse quickening, he pulled into a busy shopping center and parked, watching as the sedan cruised slowly past his spot. The driver was wearing sunglasses despite the overcast day. That night, Thomas received another phone call from an unknown number. "We know what you're doing," said the same disguised voice. "You won't get approval for the exhumation. Walk away now." Instead of being frightened, Thomas felt a surge of certainty. "Who are you? What are you afraid I'll find?" A pause. "Your mother made choices to protect you. Don't undo her sacrifice." The line went dead. Thomas called his Aunt Martha the next morning, but her neighbor answered, explaining that Martha had suddenly decided to visit her daughter in Arizona. No, she hadn't mentioned when she'd return. Yes, it was very unusual for her to leave without telling anyone. Now thoroughly alarmed, Thomas drove to his childhood home again. His father was in the backyard, half-heartedly pulling weeds from what had once been Eleanor's garden. "Dad, did Mom ever mention witness protection?" Robert straightened up slowly, wincing at the pain in his back. "What are you talking about?" "I think Mom might have been in witness protection before she met you. It would explain why there's no record of her early life, why her documents look falsified." His father stared at him for a long moment. "Tom, your mother was not in witness protection. She was a kindergarten teacher who became a housewife. Where are you getting these ideas?" "Then how do you explain this?" Thomas pulled out his phone and showed his father a document he'd found in county records. A marriage license for Eleanor Mills dated 5 years before she'd met Robert. She had apparently been married to someone named James Wilson. His father's face hardened. "Where did you get that?" "It's public record, Dad. Mom was married before. Did you know?" Robert threw down his gardening gloves. "She mentioned a brief marriage that ended badly. I didn't press for details. Everyone has a past, Tom. But there's no divorce record, and I can't find any information about this James Wilson." "Enough," Robert shouted, his face reddening. "Your mother is dead. Let her rest in peace." Thomas left, more convinced than ever that he was onto something. Back at home, he found a small package on his doorstep with no return address. Inside was an old newspaper article about a federal racketeering case from 30 years ago. Someone had circled a line mentioning an unnamed key witness who had gone into protection. There was no note, but Thomas understood the message. He took the article to his lawyer the next day to strengthen his case for exhumation. The lawyer, a practical woman named Helen Park, looked skeptical. "Courts rarely approve exhumation orders, Mr. Blackwood. usually only for criminal investigations or paternity cases. This could be criminal, Thomas insisted. I think my mother was involved in something dangerous, something she was hiding from. I think she may have left evidence in her coffin. Helen pushed her glasses up her nose. That's unusual. Do you have any concrete evidence beyond these suspicions? Thomas spread out his findings, the inconsistent documents, the threatening phone calls, his aunt's sudden departure, the newspaper clipping. Individually, each could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern. Helen agreed to file the petition but warned him that his sister's opposition would complicate matters. And be prepared for psychiatric evaluation, she added. The court will want to ensure this isn't driven by grief or mental illness. The legal process dragged on for weeks. Thomas met with court-appointed psychiatrists who asked probing questions about his relationship with his mother, his grieving process, his current mental state. He answered truthfully, aware how outlandish his theories sounded but unable to abandon them. Catherine hired her own lawyer to block the exhumation, arguing that Thomas was suffering from complicated grief and possibly a developing mental disorder. The family rift widened painfully. Their father refused to take sides but grew increasingly withdrawn as the legal battle played out in public, their family's private matters becoming gossip in the small town where everyone had loved Eleanor, Blackwood. 6 weeks into the legal proceedings, Thomas's Aunt Martha called from Arizona. I shouldn't be telling you this, she said, her voice trembling. But I can't take it to my grave, too. Thomas pressed the phone tightly to his ear. Tell me what, Aunt Martha? Your mother wasn't who you thought she was. Her real name wasn't Eleanor Mills. She testified against dangerous people a long time ago. They gave her a new name, a new life. She met your father, fell in love, thought she was safe. Thomas's heart pounded. Who were these people? What did she testify about? I don't know details. She wouldn't tell me for my own safety. But before she died, when she knew the cancer was winning, she made me promise something. She said if anything ever happened, if anyone ever came asking questions, I should tell them to look in the coffin. Did she put something in there with her? A metal box. She made arrangements with the funeral director privately. Said it contained everything you'd need to know if the past ever caught up to your family. Martha's voice cracked. I've said too much. They're watching me, even here. Be careful, Thomas. The call ended, and Thomas immediately contacted his lawyer with this new information. 2 days later, Martha suffered a stroke in Arizona. The doctor said it was likely brought on by stress. She survived but lost her ability to speak. A coincidence. Thomas couldn't bring himself to believe in anymore. Armed with Martha's statement, Thomas's case for exhumation strengthened. The judge, though reluctant, finally granted the order after Thomas agreed to severe limitations. Only he, cemetery officials, his lawyer, and a court representative would be present. Catherine refused to attend, unable to bear the thought of disturbing their mother's rest. As the date approached, Thomas began receiving more threatening calls and letters. Black cars followed him openly now. Someone broke into his house again, this time leaving a dead rose on his pillow. But Thomas wouldn't be deterred. The mystery had consumed him entirely. Whatever his mother had hidden, whatever truth lay buried, with her, he had to know, even if the knowledge came at a terrible price. The night before the scheduled exhumation, Thomas sat alone in his living room, surrounded by the scattered pieces of his mother's secret past. Tomorrow, he would finally have answers. He just hoped he was prepared for what those answers might reveal. The courthouse steps were slick with morning rain as Thomas climbed them, clutching a manila folder of documents. Today would determine whether his quest for answers could continue, or if his mother's secrets would remain buried forever. His suit felt too tight around the collar and he tugged at it nervously. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than he'd expected. His sister Catherine sat on the opposite side with her lawyer, refusing to meet his eyes. Their father hadn't come. He'd called Thomas the night before, his voice heavy with disappointment. Whatever happens tomorrow, Robert had said, you've already disturbed your mother's memory. I hope it's worth it. The words had kept Thomas awake most of the night. Judge Henderson entered, a stern woman with silver hair and piercing eyes. She reviewed the petition without expression, occasionally glancing up at Thomas as if trying to gauge his sanity. Catherine's lawyer spoke first, a polished man in an expensive suit. "Your Honor, this request is nothing short of desecration, driven by my client's brother's unhealthy fixation. Mrs. Blackwood has been at rest for 3 years. There is no valid legal reason to disturb her remains." Thomas's lawyer, Helen Park, stood next. "Your Honor, my client has discovered significant inconsistencies in his late mother's background, suggesting she may have been living under an assumed identity. He's received threatening communications since beginning this investigation and has reason to believe his mother deliberately left important information within her coffin, information that may be vital to his family's safety." Judge Henderson frowned. "Mr. Blackwood, these are extraordinary claims. Do you have any concrete evidence?" Thomas stood, his legs unsteady. "Your Honor, I've submitted the statement from my Aunt Martha Hayes, who was my mother's closest confidant. Before suffering a stroke, she confirmed that my mother arranged for a metal box to be placed in her coffin. Additionally, I've received this." He handed over the newspaper clipping about the federal racketeering case. "And I've been followed and threatened since beginning my investigation." "Coincidences and conspiracy theories," Catherine's lawyer interrupted. The court-appointed psychiatrist noted signs of paranoia in his evaluation. Thomas felt heat rising in his face. "I'm not paranoid. My aunt is in a hospital unable to speak because she told me the truth." "Mr. Blackwood," the judge warned, "control yourself." Catherine finally looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed. "Tom, please," she said quietly. "Mom wouldn't want this." "She left that box for a reason, Kath," he replied. "Whatever she was hiding, she knew we might need to know someday." The judge called a brief recess to review the documentation. In the hallway, Thomas approached his sister, who was staring out a window at the rain. "I know you think I've lost my mind," he said. "I think you never properly grieved," Catherine replied without looking at him. "You were away at that conference when she died. You missed her final days. Maybe this is your way of trying to connect with her now that it's too late." Thomas hadn't considered this perspective before. Was she right? Was all of this just displaced grief? But then he remembered the threatening phone calls, his ransacked house, Aunt Martha's stroke immediately after speaking to him. "Kath, someone has been following me. Someone broke into my house. Twice. These aren't delusions." She finally turned to him, her expression softening slightly. "Have you filed police reports? Installed security cameras?" He hadn't. The realization made him question himself momentarily. Why hadn't he taken those basic steps? Before he could answer, they were called back into the courtroom. Judge Henderson looked troubled as she adjusted her glasses. "This is an unusual case," she began. "Exhumation is a serious matter not to be granted lightly. However, the sworn statement from Martha Hayes does provide some basis for Mr. Blackwood's petition, as do the documented threats he's received." Catherine's lawyer started to object, but the judge raised her hand. "I'm granting a limited exhumation order," she continued. "The procedure will be conducted with minimal disturbance, with only essential personnel present. If no box or other evidence is found, Mr. Blackwood, the matter ends there. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded, relief washing over him. "Yes, Your Honor, thank you." Outside the courthouse, Catherine walked past him without speaking. Her lawyer handed Thomas a folded paper, formal notice that she was severing their joint executor status on their mother's estate. "She doesn't want anything to do with this," the lawyer said coldly. "Whatever you find, don't bring it to her door." Thomas watched them drive away, rain soaking through his suit jacket. The victory felt hollow without his family's support, but he was too committed to turn back now. That evening, the threatening phone call came again. "The judge made a mistake," the disguised voice said. "So did you." "Who are you?" Thomas demanded. "What are you afraid I'll find? Some secrets protect the living. Your mother understood that. If you're so concerned, why not just steal whatever's in the coffin yourself? Why threaten me instead of acting?" A pause. Because we respect the dead, even if you don't. And because your mother was valued. But make no mistake, if you expose certain truths, there will be consequences. Thomas recorded the call this time, saving it as evidence. He spent the night checking and rechecking his locks, jumping at every sound outside his windows. In the morning, he drove to his father's house, determined to make one last attempt at reconciliation before the exhumation scheduled for the following day. Robert was in the kitchen, making coffee with mechanical movements. He'd lost weight since Eleanor's death, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame. "Dad, I got the court order," Thomas said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "I heard." Robert didn't turn around. "Catherine called me in tears. I need to know if you knew anything about Mom's past. Anything unusual." His father's shoulders slumped. "Sit down, Tom." Thomas took a seat at the kitchen table, the same one where he'd eaten breakfast throughout his childhood. His father placed 2 mugs of coffee down and sat heavily across from him. "Your mother had nightmares," Robert said quietly. "Bad ones, especially in the early years. She'd wake up screaming, talking about people coming to take her away." He stared into his coffee. "When I asked questions, she'd say it was nothing, just bad dreams. But sometimes I'd catch her checking the locks 3-4 times before bed, or scanning the faces of strangers in public places." "Did she ever explain why?" Robert shook his head. "Once, when you were about 2 years old, a black car parked across from our house for 3 days straight. Eleanor wouldn't let you near the windows. She packed a bag and kept it by the door. On the 4th day, the car was gone, and she cried with relief." Thomas leaned forward. "And you never demanded answers?" "I loved her," Robert said simply. "Whatever she was running from, whoever she had been before, it didn't matter to me. She was Eleanor Blackwood, my wife, your mother. That was enough. But don't you want to know the truth now?" His father looked up, eyes suddenly fierce. "What good will it do? Will it bring her back? Will it make her death any less painful?" He pushed his untouched coffee away. "All it's done so far is tear apart what family we have left." Thomas couldn't argue with that. "I'm sorry, Dad, but I have to see this through." "Then do it," Robert said, standing up. "But don't expect me to watch." The morning of the exhumation dawned gray and cool. Thomas arrived at the cemetery to find the court representative already there, a solemn woman in a dark suit who introduced herself as Mrs. Chen. His lawyer arrived next, followed by the cemetery director and 2 workers with shovels and equipment. "The procedure should take about 2 hours, the director explained. "We'll need to remove the soil, lift the vault, and open the casket on site. I must warn you, Mr. Blackwood, after 3 years there will be significant decomposition." Thomas nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. The reality of what he was about to witness hit him suddenly. This wasn't just an investigation anymore. This was his mother. As the workers began to dig, Thomas stood apart from the others, watching rain clouds gather overhead. Was Catherine right? Was this all just his unresolved grief? Was he about to desecrate his mother's grave for nothing? The excavation seemed to take forever, the sound of metal against earth rhythmic and jarring. When they finally reached the concrete burial vault, Thomas felt lightheaded. The workers carefully attached straps to lift the heavy container. "Mr. Blackwood," his lawyer called. "They're ready to open the vault. Are you sure you want to proceed?" Thomas walked forward on legs that felt disconnected from his body. "Yes, I'm sure." The cemetery director supervised as the workers removed the vault lid, revealing Eleanor's coffin below. It was a dark walnut casket with brass fittings, just as Thomas remembered from the funeral. Despite the sealed vault, water damage was visible on the wood. "Standard procedure is to open it here," the director said quietly. "Once we confirm the presence or absence of the item in question, we can re-enter immediately." Thomas nodded, unable to take his eyes off the coffin. In moments he would either have vindication or be exposed as a grief-stricken fool who had disturbed his mother's rest for nothing. The workers unlatched the casket lid, and the cemetery director looked to Thomas for final confirmation. Taking a deep breath, Thomas stepped forward. "Open it." The lid rose slowly and Thomas forced himself to look inside. The court representative gasped softly beside him. There, nestled in the decomposed remains of what had once been his mother, was a metal lockbox, and on her skeleton finger not the gold wedding band his father had given her, but a different ring entirely, silver with a distinctive blue stone. "My God," Helen whispered. "You were right." Thomas stared at the lockbox, vindication mixing, with a fresh wave of grief and uncertainty. Whatever secrets his mother had kept, he was about to uncover them, for better or worse. The court representative found her voice. "Please retrieve the box, document it, and reseal the casket immediately." As one of the workers carefully lifted the metal box from Eleanor's remains, Thomas noticed something else, a small envelope tucked underneath. His name was written on it in his mother's handwriting. "That too," he said, pointing. With both items, removed and documented, the cemetery workers quickly closed the casket. Thomas stood clutching the lockbox, the envelope tucked in his pocket, as they resealed the vault and began refilling the grave. "What happens now?" Mrs. Chen asked. Thomas looked down at the box in his hands. It was heavier than he expected, with a small keyhole that matched the key he'd found in his mother's study. "Now I find out who my mother really was." Thomas drove home with the metal box secured in the passenger seat beside him, stealing glances at it every few minutes as if it might disappear. Rain had started to fall again, drumming on the car roof and blurring the road ahead. His mind raced, with possibilities about what the box might contain. The court representative, Mrs. Chen, had insisted on documenting the entire retrieval process. She'd taken photographs and made detailed notes before allowing Thomas to take possession of the box and envelope. "These items legally belong to the estate," she had explained. "As one of the executors, you have the right to examine them, but they must remain intact as evidence." Evidence of what, exactly, she hadn't specified. Now, as he pulled into his driveway, Thomas noticed his front door was ajar again. He sat in the car, engine idling, staring at the gap between door and frame. Someone had broken in while he was at the cemetery. He considered calling the police, but remembered the threatening phone calls. Whoever was after his mother's secrets likely had resources beyond local law enforcement. Instead, he reversed out of the driveway and headed to a small motel on the outskirts of town. In the shabby room with its faded floral bedspread, Thomas placed the box on the bed and sat beside it. His hands trembled as he removed the small brass key from his wallet. Before inserting it into the lock, he took out the envelope from his pocket. His name was written in his mother's neat handwriting, the ink slightly faded. The paper felt fragile in his fingers as he carefully opened it. The letter inside was brief. "My dearest Thomas, if you're reading this, you've discovered there was more to my life than I ever shared. I'm sorry for the secrets. Everything you need to know is in this box. Be careful who you trust with this information. Some dangers never fade. I've loved you from the first moment I held you. Nothing about that was ever a lie. Always Mom." Thomas read the letter 3 times, tracing his finger over the word Mom. His throat tightened with emotion. Even in death, she'd been protecting him, leaving a contingency plan in case the past ever caught up with her family. Taking a deep breath, he inserted the key into the lockbox. It turned with a satisfying click, and he lifted the lid. Inside, neatly organized, were several folders, a small leather journal, a USB drive, and a sealed envelope marked "Official Use Only." On top lay a worn ID card with his mother's photo, but a different name, Catherine Reynolds. "Catherine," he whispered, testing the strange name that belonged to the woman who had raised him. Had she ever almost slipped, he wondered? Had she ever almost responded to her real name during all those years of living as Eleanor? He opened the first folder to find newspaper clippings about a massive federal investigation into political corruption from 30 years ago. One headline read, "Reynolds Construction Empire Linked to Organized Crime," accompanied by a photo of a distinguished-looking older man identified as William Reynolds, CEO. The next folder contained legal documents, witness statements, Immunity agreements and Federal Protection Program paperwork for Catherine Reynolds, daughter of William Reynolds. Thomas's hands shook as he realized the implications. His mother had been the daughter of a criminal empire's head, and she had turned state's evidence against her own father. The journal was filled with his mother's handwriting, starting from just before she entered witness protection. The first entry read, "They're moving me tomorrow. New name, new history, new life. Agent Thompson says I might never be able to go back to being Catherine Reynolds. The price of doing the right thing is losing everything I've ever known. I keep telling myself it's worth it to stop what father was doing, but tonight I'm terrified." Thomas flipped through the journal, reading snippets of his mother's hidden life. 6 months as Eleanor Mills. Still look over my shoulder everywhere I go. Thompson checks in weekly. Says father's organization is still looking for me even with him in prison. Met a man today. Robert. He teaches high school science and laughs with his whole body. First time I've wanted to tell someone the truth, but I can't. Robert proposed, I said yes. Thompson says it's a bad idea, too risky to build a life, start a family. But I can't live as a ghost forever. I just can't. Thomas was born today. Perfect in every way. Holding him, I finally understand why I had to testify. Why father's corruption had to end. I want my son to live in a better world. With each entry, Thomas felt like he was meeting his mother for the first time. Not Eleanor Blackwood, the gentle kindergarten teacher and devoted mother, but Catherine Reynolds, the brave whistleblower who sacrificed everything to bring down a criminal enterprise. The USB drive contained scanned copies of all the paper documents, plus audio recordings. Thomas plugged it into his laptop and clicked on the first audio file. Interview with witness Catherine Reynolds, April 15, 1990. A younger version of his mother's voice filled the motel room. The offshore accounts were set up through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. My father used them to launder bribes from government contracts. I worked in the accounting department, so I saw all the transactions. Thomas listened, transfixed, as his mother methodically exposed a network of corruption that had reached into state government, law enforcement, and major construction projects. She sounded younger but had the same careful way of choosing her words that he remembered. The sealed official envelope contained a letter from the U.S. Marshal Service, dated just 1 month before his mother's death. Dear Ms. Reynolds, we regret to inform you that William Reynolds will be granted compassionate release due to terminal illness. While he has served 28 years of his sentence, we understand this development may cause you concern. Your protected status remains in effect, but we recommend reviewing your security protocols. A new contact agent will be assigned to your case. Please utilize the enclosed secure line for any emergencies. Thomas sat back, overwhelmed. His mother had known her father was being released even as cancer was consuming her own body. Had she feared he would seek revenge? Is that why she'd prepared the lockbox? A knock at the motel room door startled him from his thoughts. He quickly gathered the documents, shoving them back into the box. Mr. Blackwood? It's Agent Dawson, Federal Marshal Service. Thomas froze. How had they found him? I need to speak with you about Catherine Reynolds. Cautiously, Thomas approached the door. How do I know who you really are? Your mother's handler was Agent Michael Thompson. The man in the photograph you received? That was him. I was his partner. Thomas's heart raced. The mysterious man in the photo with his mother, her federal handler, not a lover or secret husband. He opened the door slightly, chain still in place. A tall woman with cropped gray hair showed him a badge. May I come in? It's not safe to talk. Out here. After checking her credentials carefully, Thomas let her enter. Agent Dawson surveyed the documents spread across the bed. I see you found Catherine's insurance policy, she said, her expression grim. We've been monitoring the situation since you filed for exhumation. Unfortunately, others have been watching too. Who? Thomas asked. Who's been threatening me? Your grandfather died 3 months ago, she explained, sitting in the room's only chair. But his organization didn't die with him. There are people who fear what Catherine knew, what evidence she might have kept back as leverage. My grandfather, Thomas repeated, the word feeling strange on his tongue. I never knew I had one. Count yourself lucky, Dawson said dryly. William Reynolds was responsible for at least 5 murders we know of, plus decades of corruption that cost taxpayers millions. Your mother's testimony was crucial in bringing him down. Thomas gestured to the box. So these people, whoever's left from his organization, they think there's something in here that could still hurt them? Catherine was smart. She kept what we call a dead man's switch, evidence held back in case anything happened to her. The organization knew about it, but not where it was hidden. Dawson picked up the journal. After she died of natural causes, they thought they were safe, until you started asking questions. But I didn't know anything about this until I got that photograph. Who sent it? Agent Dawson's expression softened slightly. Michael Thompson. Before he died last year, he asked me to keep an eye on Eleanor Blackwood's family. When we noticed unusual surveillance around your house, he thought you should know the truth about your mother. The pieces were falling into place. So the people following me, breaking into my house, they're from my grandfather's criminal organization? What's left of it, Dawson confirmed. Aging soldiers afraid their past crimes will catch up with them. Thomas thought of his Aunt Martha, hospitalized after speaking to him. Did they hurt my aunt? We have no evidence of that, but we can't rule it out. Stress can trigger strokes naturally. Dawson leaned forward. Mr. Blackwood, I need to know what's in that box. Your mother may have kept evidence that could help us finish what she started. Thomas hesitated, suddenly unsure whom to trust. His entire life had been built on secrets and lies, however well-intentioned. How could he know this woman was telling the truth? There's a way you can verify who I am, Dawson said, reading his doubt. The USB drive should contain a list of trusted contacts, each with a code phrase. Look for Elaine Dawson, code Delta 7 Monarch. Thomas returned to the laptop and searched through the files until he found a document titled Emergency Contacts. There, listed third, was Elaine Dawson, with the exact code phrase she'd mentioned. Okay, he said, closing the laptop. What happens now? Now we need to get you and these documents to a secure location. Your sister and father too, as a precaution. Dawson stood. Pack everything up. We need to move quickly. As Thomas gathered the contents of the lockbox, his phone rang. Catherine. Tom? Someone broke into my house, she said, her voice shaking. They ransacked the place looking for something. Dad's with me, but we're scared. The police are on their way, but... Kath. Listen carefully, Thomas interrupted. I'm with a federal marshal. She says we're in danger. Don't tell the police anything about Mom or the exhumation. Just say it was a random break-in. We'll be there to pick you up in 20 minutes. When he hung up, Dawson was already moving toward the door, hand on her weapon. Change of plans. We get your family first, then go to the safe house. Thomas clutched the metal box that contained his mother's true legacy. Not just secrets and danger, but incredible courage. Eleanor Blackwood, Catherine Reynolds, had sacrificed everything to stand up against corruption, then built a new life, filled with love and normality for her children. She protected us all our lives, Thomas said as they hurried to the car. Now it's our turn to finish what she started. The safe house was a modest lakeside cabin about 2 hours from town. Thomas watched from the window as Agent Dawson spoke, with 2 other marshals outside. Inside, Catherine sat at a wooden table with their father, both still looking stunned from everything Thomas had told them during the drive. I still can't believe it, Catherine said, running her finger along a knot in the table's surface. Mom was in witness protection. She testified against her own father, all those years, and she never said a word. Robert stared at his hands, wedding ring gleaming in the cabin's dim light. I suspected something, he admitted. Not this exactly, but something. The way she'd sometimes wake up screaming. How she'd check the locks 3 times before bed. Why didn't you ever ask her? Thomas turned from the window. His father looked up, eyes tired. Because she didn't want me to know, and I respected that. Agent Dawson came back inside, removing her jacket. Perimeter's secure. We'll stay here until we've analyzed all the documents and determined the threat level. Thomas placed the metal box on the table. I want my family to hear everything, no more secrets. Dawson nodded. Fair enough. But first, I need to know exactly what your mother left behind. They spent the next several hours going through the contents of the box methodically. The journal revealed that Catherine Reynolds, the woman they had known as Eleanor, had been the chief accountant for Reynolds Construction, her father's company. She had discovered evidence of bribery, money laundering, and connections to organized crime. When she confronted her father, he had threatened her. Listen to this, Thomas said, reading from the journal. Father laughed when I showed him the ledgers, said I was naive to think business worked any other way. When I mentioned going to the authorities, his expression changed. You're my daughter, he told me, but don't think that will protect you if you cross me. Catherine covered her mouth with her hand. Our grandfather threatened to kill his own daughter? William Reynolds wasn't just any criminal, Agent Dawson explained. He built a legitimate business empire that served as a front for organized crime operations across 3 states. His political connections protected him for years. Catherine's testimony was the breakthrough we needed. Thomas continued reading. Agent Thompson says once I testify, I can never be Catherine Reynolds again. I'll have a new name, new background, new everything. The thought terrifies me, but not as much as what Father would do if he found me. Robert cleared his throat. So she became Eleanor Mills. Yes, Dawson said. We created a complete background. School, records, employment history, everything. She was placed in your town because it was small, quiet, far from her father's sphere of influence. And then she met Dad, Catherine said softly. Robert smiled sadly. At a school fundraiser. I was teaching science. She was the new kindergarten teacher. I thought she was the most elegant woman I'd ever seen. The USB drive contained more than just Catherine's testimony. There were financial records, photographs of meetings between William Reynolds and known criminals, and, most damning, recordings of conversations where he explicitly discussed bribing officials and threatening witnesses. This is incredible, Dawson said, reviewing the files. Catherine gave us enough for the initial prosecution, but she clearly held back some insurance. This evidence could have taken down more than just her father. It implicates judges, police, chief, state officials. Why didn't she turn it all over back then? Thomas asked. Because she was smart, Dawson replied. She knew that her father's organization had deep roots. If anything happened to her in protection, this evidence would surface. It kept her safer. Catherine, who had been quiet for some time, suddenly spoke up. Those men who broke into my house, they were looking for this, weren't they? They thought I might have Mom's evidence. Dawson nodded. With William Reynolds dead, the organization is vulnerable. When Thomas started investigating, they panicked. They've probably been watching all of you for years, just in case. The room fell silent. As the reality of their situation sank in, their mother had lived with this danger hanging over her for decades, all while creating a normal, loving home for her children. What happens now? Robert asked, his voice stronger than it had been all day. Now we use this evidence, Dawson said. Catherine, you're Eleanor. Her testimony put William Reynolds away, but many of his associates continued operating. With this, we can finally dismantle what's left of the organization. Will we be safe then? Catherine asked. Yes, Dawson promised. But until then, you'll all remain in protective custody. Later that night, after Catherine and Robert had gone to bed in the cabin's small bedrooms, Thomas sat by the fireplace, with his mother's journal. Agent Dawson brought him a cup of coffee and sat in the adjacent chair. You remind me of her, she said after a moment. You knew my mother? Thomas looked up, surprised. I met her several times during the original case. I was just starting out then. But Catherine made an impression. She had this quiet strength about her. Scared to death but determined to do the right thing. Thomas turned the pages of the journal, finding an entry from just after his birth. She writes here about being afraid they would find us, that her children would pay for her choices. That fear never left her, Dawson said. but neither did her conviction that she'd done the right thing. "I wish I'd known," Thomas said quietly. "I wish she could have told us the truth." "Would you have thought of her differently?" Thomas considered the question. Would knowing Eleanor was actually Catherine, a whistleblower who betrayed her criminal father, have changed how he saw the mother who bandaged his scraped knees and cheered at his graduations? "I would have been proud of her," he finally said. "Terrified for her, but proud." Dawson smiled. "I think she knew that. But the longer her secret stayed buried, the harder it became to dig up." "Until I literally dug it up," Thomas said with a hint of dark humor. "Your grandfather died still hating her for what she did," Dawson said after a long pause. "His organization has been looking for her evidence for 30 years. You did what no federal agent could do. You found it. Because she wanted me to," Thomas realized. Not right away, but if it ever became necessary. The next morning, 2 more federal agents arrived at the cabin. While Catherine and Robert ate breakfast, Thomas and Dawson went outside to speak with them privately. "We've analyzed the initial documents," the senior agent, a stern-looking man named Harris, explained. "This is enough to move against key figures in the Reynolds organization immediately. We'll need formal statements from all of you, but that can wait until you're safely relocated." "Relocated?" Thomas repeated. "For how long?" "That depends on how quickly we can dismantle the network," Harris said. "Could be weeks, could be months." The reality of what this meant hit Thomas suddenly. They would have to leave their homes, their jobs, their lives, just as his mother had done 30 years ago. "Is there any other way?" he asked. Dawson and Harris exchanged looks. "There might be," Dawson said carefully, "but it would be risky." They outlined an alternative plan, used Thomas, Catherine, and Robert as bait to draw out the remaining leaders of the organization, capturing them in a coordinated sting operation. The family would appear to return to their normal lives while under constant surveillance. "Absolutely not," Thomas said immediately. "I won't put my family in that kind of danger." "It's not your decision alone," Catherine's voice came from behind them. She had stepped outside unnoticed. "This affects all of us." Inside, they presented both options to Robert. To Thomas's surprise, his father straightened his shoulders and spoke with clarity. "Eleanor, Catherine, she spent her life protecting us from these people. She wouldn't want us to run forever." He looked at each of his children. "I say we finish this once and for all." After intense discussion, they agreed to the sting operation. For the next 2 weeks, they would return home and resume their normal routines, with federal agents watching from a distance. The evidence from Eleanor's lockbox would be discovered through a carefully orchestrated leak, drawing the organization's leaders into the open. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Thomas found himself alone with his father for a moment. "Dad, are you sure about this? It could be dangerous." Robert looked at the wedding ring he'd worn for over 30 years. "You know, when I gave Eleanor this ring, she cried more than most brides. I thought it was just emotion, but now I understand. She was giving herself permission to truly become Eleanor Blackwood, to believe her new life could last." He looked up at his son. "She was the bravest person I've ever known. We owe her this." 3 days later, Thomas sat in his living room with the lights on, curtains intentionally left open. The metal box from his mother's coffin sat visibly on the coffee table. According to the plan, word had been leaked through carefully chosen channels that Thomas Blackwood had discovered explosive evidence from Catherine Reynolds. Adhering and Robert were at Catherine's house, similarly staged for visibility but with agents hidden throughout the property. Thomas tried to act natural, occasionally walking past windows, making himself a target. Around midnight, his phone rang, the signal that movement had been detected outside. Thomas's heart pounded as he forced himself to remain seated, pretending to read while actually watching the shadows moving across his lawn. The back door opened with a soft click. Thomas didn't react, keeping his eyes on his book as footsteps approached from behind. "Mr. Blackwood," a raspy voice said, "we need to talk about your mother." Thomas turned slowly to find an elderly man in an expensive suit standing in his living room. Despite his age, his eyes were sharp and cold. "Uncle Joseph," Thomas said, using the code phrase to alert the listening agents that the target had arrived. "How did you get in?" "I've been watching this house for 30 years, the man said. "Since before you were born. Since your mother betrayed her family." He gestured to two younger men who had entered behind him. "The box. Where is it?" Thomas nodded toward the coffee table. "Right there. I've been expecting you, actually." The old man's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that so?" "Catherine Reynolds was my mother," Thomas said, standing slowly. "But Eleanor Blackwood raised me. She taught me that the truth always comes out eventually." As the man moved toward the box, federal agents burst through every door and window, weapons drawn. Federal marshals, on the ground now. In the chaos that followed, Thomas watched as his mother's past was finally laid to rest. The man, identified later as Howard Deckard, his grandfather's right-hand man and the organization's current leader, and his associates were taken into custody without a shot fired. 3 months later, Thomas, Catherine, and Robert stood at Eleanor's grave. The headstone had been replaced with a new one that read, "Eleanor Blackwood, beloved wife and mother. Truth is the highest courage." "Do you think she'd approve?" Catherine asked, placing flowers beside the stone. "Of the new headstone, or of what we did?" Thomas asked. "Both, I suppose." Robert knelt to brush some leaves from the grave. "She would have hated that we were in danger, but I think she'd be proud that her children showed the same courage she did." Thomas nodded, thinking of the journal now secured in a safety deposit box with copies given to federal prosecutors. His mother's evidence had already led to dozens of arrests, with more expected as the investigation continued. "The agent said Grandpa died still hating her," Catherine said quietly. "How sad to hate your own child that much." "He hated what she did, not who she was," Thomas corrected. "And what she did was extraordinary." As they walked back to their cars, Thomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. His mother had lived 2 lives, Catherine Reynolds, who brought down a criminal empire at great personal cost, and Eleanor Blackwood, who created a loving family despite the fear that never fully left her. Both women were remarkable. Both were his mother. "You know," Robert said as they reached the cemetery gates, "your mother always said you were stubborn like her father. Turns out she was right, just not in the way any of us understood." Thomas smiled. "I'm glad I was stubborn enough to dig up her grave." "So am I," Catherine admitted, linking her arm through his. Some truth shouldn't stay buried forever. Together, they walked into the sunshine, carrying Eleanor's legacy, both the one she'd shared with them and the one she'd kept hidden, into a future finally free of shadows.